Some mysteries do not emerge in daylight, but in the flicker of memory and fear. It begins with a pale woman's desperate claim that 4 visitors entered her home, though every witness swears there were only 3. Within locked doors, hidden papers, and a phantom presence, Holmes must untangle deception from illusion. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The shadows gather, the fog thickens. Let us step with Holmes into the enigma of the 4th visitor. The night upon which this strange affair first came to our attention was one of those London evenings when the very heavens seemed to brood with menace. The rain fell in steady torrents, rattling upon the panes of Baker Street and hissing upon the cobbles below. A wild wind moaned through the chimneys, carrying with it the distant clang of carriage wheels and the melancholy toll of St. Marylebone's clock tower. I sat by the fire, grateful for its warmth, though I confess that even the flames appeared cowed by the storm, shrinking back against the grate, as if unwilling to stand their ground against so furious an onslaught. Holmes, with his habitual composure, was stretched upon the settee, long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. The glow of the lamp fell across his hawk-like features, which betrayed neither fatigue nor curiosity, but only that cool stillness that ever marked the prelude to some great mental effort. Outside, the storm might have been the tumult of a world in chaos. Within, my companion's mind was as calm and ordered as the shelves of chemical vials that lined our walls. "It is curious, Watson," he remarked after a silence broken only by the rain's ceaseless drumming, "how nature's tempests seem to stir the troubled heart into action. One can almost predict that a knock shall come upon that door when the wind is at its height." I smiled faintly at his words, yet even as I was about to reply, the knocker sounded, a sharp, desperate summons that seemed to confirm his prophecy to the letter. The door opened upon a vision of distress such as I have seldom beheld. A lady stood framed in the storm, her cloak drenched and clinging, her pale face half hidden by a veil that could not disguise the tremor of her lips, nor the terror that smouldered in her eyes. Mrs. Hudson ushered her quickly inside, and Holmes, rising with swift courtesy, motioned her toward the chair by the fire. "Pray be seated, madam," said he, in that grave, measured tone which seemed to steady even the most disordered of minds. "You are safe here. Compose yourself, and tell us what has so grievously disturbed you." The lady obeyed, though her hands continued to twist her gloves in restless agitation. "My name is Lady Eleanor Faraday," she whispered, "and I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to lend me your aid. I fear my reason may desert me if I cannot obtain an explanation for what I have endured this night." Her voice, though tremulous, carried a note of desperation that impressed me deeply. She glanced from Holmes to myself, as though imploring both our confidences, then pressed a hand to her temple, as if the recollection alone was unbearable. The rain beat fiercely against the windows, and her words seemed but another echo of that gathering storm. "It began," she continued, "with the arrival of 3 gentlemen at our house this evening. My husband received them in his study, one after another, though I myself did not hear their discourse. The servants admitted each visitor at the appointed time, and all was in order. Yet," she faltered here, her breath quickening. "Yet?" Holmes urged, his eyes narrowing with keen intensity. "Yet there was a 4th, Mr. Holmes. A 4th man entered our home, though no servant opened the door for him, and no one save myself beheld him. I saw him with my own eyes as clearly as I now see you. He passed down the corridor, silent as a shadow, and entered the study where my husband already sat with his last caller. But when I asked the staff, they swore with one voice that only 3 had come." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon her as though her very soul were a page he sought to decipher. I confess that a shudder passed through me, for the conviction in her voice left no room for trifling fancy. Lady Eleanor clasped her hands, her eyes wide and haunted. "They tell me I was mistaken, that fear or fancy misled me," she said, her tone breaking into anguish. "But I know what I saw. There were 4, not 3. 4 men crossed our threshold this night, and one of them carried with him an air of such dread that I have not ceased to tremble since." For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the lash of the rain. Holmes alone remained motionless, though I observed the quick flicker of his eyes, the subtle tightening of his lips, as though some chord of recognition had been struck. "My dear Lady Eleanor," he said at last, with a calmness that belied the gravity of her words, "your account is most remarkable. 4, where there should have been 3, a shadow unacknowledged yet undeniably present. We must consider carefully whether the mind was deceived, or whether a deception more deliberate lies beneath." She looked at him as though clinging to the hope that he alone might unravel the tangle of her dread. Yet before further words could be exchanged, there came a rap at the door below, hurried and insistent. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and breathless, bearing a sealed envelope upon a salver. Holmes broke the seal, his eyes scanning the message with that swift, piercing concentration that was his gift. He rose slowly, his expression grave. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "you have spoken of fear. I regret to inform you that your fears were not misplaced. Your husband has been discovered dead in his study, locked from within." The cry that burst from her lips echoed the very storm. Outside, and as she sank back into the chair, I felt the chill of some inexorable fate settling over us all. For a long moment, Holmes did not stir. Lady Eleanor's trembling words still hung in the air, a strange and haunting refrain, while the storm raged its accompaniment outside. I confess that my own mind rebelled against her tale. 4 men, when every servant, sober, reliable people, spoke with one voice that only 3 had entered. Could grief or nervous agitation have conjured such a phantom in her mind? Yet Holmes betrayed neither surprise nor skepticism. His long fingers tapped gently upon the arm of his chair, his eyes fixed upon the distraught lady with that peculiar steadiness which seemed at once to invite confidence and to extract truth. "You say you beheld the 4th man clearly?" he asked at length, his voice calm, measured, and devoid of reproach. "As clearly as I behold you, sir," she replied, her voice breaking as though under some intolerable strain. "And yet," Holmes continued, leaning forward a fraction, "your servants, who were alert, who admitted each caller in due course, perceived nothing of him, not even a shadow, not even the sound of a latch or a step upon the stair." Her hands twisted convulsively in her lap. "They swear it, Mr. Holmes, but they are wrong. They must be wrong. I saw him. He passed me as surely as I sit before you. I cannot be deceived." Her conviction rang with such force that I, despite my doubt, felt a chill creep along my spine. Still, Holmes gave no sign of judgment. He regarded her with his keen, penetrating gaze, and I fancied that behind those grey eyes a chain of reasoning already began to take form, weaving her words into some pattern invisible to myself. "Your description of this 4th visitor, Lady Eleanor, was it distinct?" Holmes asked quietly. She faltered, pressing her hand to her brow. He was tall, yes. His cloak was drawn about him, and his hat shaded his face. The light in the corridor was dim, yet I am certain it was no servant, nor familiar friend. He walked with such purpose, such coldness, that I felt a dread seize me." Holmes inclined his head slightly, then sank back against his chair, his lips pressed together in a thin line. For some minutes he remained thus, silent, his gaze turned inward. Only the fire's crackle and the rain's steady assault upon the windows disturbed the hush of the room. I could endure it no longer. "Holmes," I said, "surely you do not give credence to this apparition. Is it not far more probable that Lady Eleanor's senses, strained by the storm and the lateness of the hour, played her false?" But Holmes only raised a hand, stilling me with that subtle authority he wielded so effortlessly. His eyes, sharp as steel, never left our visitor. "The mind deceives us, Watson, but so too do men. The difficulty lies in discerning which has occurred. Lady Eleanor seemed on the brink of collapse, her strength spent by the effort of recalling what had shaken her so deeply. She pressed a trembling handkerchief to her lips, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Holmes, observing her, rose and poured a measure of brandy from the decanter upon the sideboard, which she accepted with a faint word of thanks. It was at that moment that the knock came, a furious pounding upon the street door, so violent it startled even me from my chair. The storm, it seemed, had found its echo in that summons. Mrs. Hudson, alarmed, hurried to answer and returned, but moments later, bearing a sealed envelope upon a salver. "For Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice uneasy. Holmes took the envelope without haste, though I noticed his eyes glint as they fell upon the unfamiliar seal. He tore it open with a swift movement, and as he read the lines within, I saw the colour drain fractionally from his face. "What is it?" I asked, rising. Holmes folded the paper deliberately, his gaze fixed upon Lady Eleanor. "Madam," he said gravely, "your apprehensions are justified. I regret to inform you that your husband has been discovered lifeless in his study. The door was locked from within. The windows were barred. No key has been found." Her cry pierced the room, raw and terrible, as though the storm outside had broken within her very breast. She clutched at the chair for support, and I hurried to her side, fearful she might faint. Her eyes, wide with horror, turned not upon Holmes nor upon myself, but towards some invisible terror only she perceived. "Then it was true," she whispered hoarsely. "He came. The fourth man came for him." The words struck through me with a chill as sharp as the wind's lash. Holmes alone remained unmoved, though I observed the tightening of his jaw, the set of his features, as though he had glimpsed the outline of some grim design. "Compose yourself, Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone firm yet not unkind. "We must not waste an instant. Watson, the night's work begins." As the storm roared its fury across London, I knew that we stood upon the threshold of one of the strangest and most perilous cases ever to fall within the sphere of my great friend's powers. And in that instant, I, too, could not help but wonder, was there truly a fourth visitor, or only the shadow of fear itself? The following morning saw us bound upon a dreary journey that seemed more befitting of a funeral cortege than of an investigative errand. Lady Eleanor, swathed in black and heavy veils, sat opposite Holmes and me within the cab, her countenance pale as ivory and her hands clasped tightly upon her lap. Outside, the storm had not abated. Indeed, it appeared to have gathered new strength during the night. The wind whistled mournfully through the hedgerows, and the rain lashed at the windows with such fury that I could scarce see more than a few feet into the murk beyond. Holmes, however, appeared utterly absorbed in the play of his thoughts. His eyes, half closed, betrayed that peculiar inward concentration which I had come to recognize as the prelude to some important deduction. He spoke little, save once, when he remarked in a low tone, "Fog, Watson, is ever a faithful accomplice of crime. It obscures, it muffles, and it misleads, qualities often shared by human testimony." Lady Eleanor shivered at his words and turned her face to the window, as though fearful of what spectres might loom beyond the veil of mist. For my part, I confessed to a growing sense of oppression, as though the very air were thick with foreboding. I could not shake from my mind her haunting declaration of the night before. The fourth man came for him. At length, the cab turned through a pair of iron gates, their hinges groaning as though reluctant to admit us, and we entered the grounds of Faraday Manor. The house rose before us, its darkened gables outlined faintly against the lowering sky. It was a grim edifice of stone, its windows shuttered, its chimneys belching smoke that seemed to mingle with the storm clouds themselves. As we approached, Lady Eleanor clutched my arm. "Every brick of this house seems to weigh upon me," she whispered. "It is as though the walls themselves conspire to hide his death." Within, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The hall was vast, but poorly lit. Heavy draperies smothered what little daylight sought admission. and the air was tinged with the scent of damp stone and extinguished fires. Footsteps echoed hollowly across the flagstones, and in the silence that followed our entrance, I fancied that some unseen watcher regarded us from the upper landing. Holmes, however, wasted no time upon sentiment. His eyes roved over the scene with quick, darting precision, noting the arrangement of the furniture, the marks upon the carpet, and the positions of the lamps. His expression betrayed nothing, yet I knew from experience that every detail was already stored within that remarkable mind of his. Lady Eleanor paused at the threshold of the study, her breath catching audibly. It was here, she murmured, that her husband had met his fate, locked away with the mysterious fourth visitor she alone had glimpsed. She could not bring herself to cross the threshold, and so it was Holmes and I who entered, leaving her trembling in the hall. We had not long to wait before the household staff were summoned. First came the butler, a tall, grave man whose solemnity seemed carved into his very features. He spoke with measured precision, recounting how he had admitted 3 visitors that evening: the banker, the cousin, and the solicitor. Each he had observed with his own eyes. Each had been properly announced, but no 4th man had passed through that door. Of this he was adamant. Next appeared the maid, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes red from weeping. She too insisted that no stranger had entered. She had fetched the lamps, served the tea, and remained within sight of the hall for much of the evening. If any man had come, she declared with trembling earnestness, she must have seen him. Finally, the secretary, a young fellow of nervous temperament, was called. His testimony echoed the others. 3 visitors only, no more. He had taken down notes of his master's discussions, and his account of the times corresponded closely with that of the butler. Holmes listened to each with an inscrutable countenance, his questions quick, precise, and disarming. More than once I detected a flicker of unease pass across the faces of those interrogated, as though they felt his gaze penetrated their innermost thoughts. Yet in every particular, their answers converged. 3 visitors, never 4. When the last had departed, Holmes paced the length of the hall, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bent in thought. "You observe, Watson," he said at last, "how absolute unanimity may itself be a cause for suspicion. Men, when truthful, differ in trifles. When they conspire, however unconsciously, they are apt to agree too well." Lady Eleanor, who had been listening in tortured silence, clasped her hands together. "You see, Mr. Holmes, they are wrong, all of them. I alone spoke the truth. There was another, I know it." Holmes regarded her with a look at once grave and compassionate. "Perhaps you are right, Lady Eleanor," he said softly. "But if so, then we must ask not only who the 4th visitor was, but by what art he contrived to pass unseen." Holmes bade the butler unlock the fatal chamber, and with a key that trembled audibly against the metal, the man obeyed. The study into which we stepped bore that chill solemnity which ever attends a room where death has lately lingered. The curtains were drawn, permitting but the meagre light of the storm to filter in, and the fire upon the hearth had died into grey ash. Upon the great oak desk lay scattered papers, some orderly, some strewn as if by sudden violence. An inkstand, displaced from its accustomed position, lay tilted upon its side, a black trail staining the surface like frozen blood. Holmes bent over it, his sharp gaze noting the irregularities with the swiftness of one to whom such trifles were pregnant with meaning. The body itself had already been removed, yet its absence seemed to weigh more heavily upon the room than its presence could have done. The door, we were reminded, had been found locked from within. The windows, Holmes confirmed with a brief inspection, were barred with iron fastenings which had not been tampered with. Escape, it would seem, had been impossible. Yet Holmes's attention was drawn less to what was absent than to what remained. He knelt by the hearth, brushing the grey ash lightly aside with a long, delicate finger. "Mud," he murmured, "recent, damp, and not native to this chamber." His eyes followed a faint trail, so faint I should never have discerned it, which led a few inches upon the rug before fading. Holmes straightened, his expression grave. A locked room is but a locked mind, Watson. The question is never how it was fastened, but who held the key to its unlocking. I felt a shiver, not merely from the damp air, but from the weight of his words, for they seemed to echo a meaning more sinister than the physical barrier of bolt or lock. Our inspection had scarce concluded when the sound of shuffling steps approached from the corridor. An elderly figure emerged from the dimness, his lantern casting grotesque shadows upon the panelled walls. He was introduced to us, with visible reluctance from the butler, as Mr. Weatherby, the adjoining landowner, and an old acquaintance of the late Mr. Faraday. His eyes, sunken yet feverishly bright, fixed upon Lady Eleanor with unsettling intensity. "So it has come to this," he muttered, his voice cracked as though seldom used. "The sins of the fathers visited upon the sons. The Faradays could never escape it, not with blood upon their hands." Lady Eleanor recoiled. "What do you mean, sir?" she whispered. The old man leaned upon his stick, his expression twisted with a grim satisfaction. "You live in a house steeped in treachery. Did you never hear of the duel between the brothers? One slain upon the very lawn, the other exiled in disgrace, betrayal, inheritance, jealousy. Such is the soil upon which your house was built. And now the shadow has returned." Holmes regarded the speaker with his cold, penetrating gaze. "Legends are convenient masks for ignorance, Mr. Weatherby, but truth does not haunt corridors. It is men who do so." Yet I confess that a chill passed over me at the man's words, and Lady Eleanor clutched her veil as though to shut out the poison of his speech. Even Holmes, though unmoved in countenance, lingered a moment longer in the shadowy corridor before turning back toward the study, as though storing the strange testimony away for some later hour. It was while Holmes busied himself once more with the papers upon the desk that I, moving clumsily about the chamber, caught my boot against the edge of a carpet. I stumbled, and as I bent to set it right, my hand brushed against something yielding beneath the fabric. Curiosity roused, I pulled back the corner, and there, half hidden in the gloom, lay a glove, stiff with blood. I lifted it with care, my heart thudding heavily in my breast. It was of fine kid leather, delicate in size, quite unsuited to the hand of the late master of the house. "Holmes!" I cried, my voice hushed with astonishment. "See here, this cannot be his." Holmes took the glove between finger and thumb, examining it with that cold detachment which belied the keenness of his interest. "No, Watson," said he softly. "This was never his. It belonged to another, smaller hand, lighter frame. It is the mark not of the victim, but of one who stood too close to him in his final hour." Lady Eleanor uttered a faint cry and pressed her hands to her lips, while the butler, white as the plastered wall behind him, muttered a prayer under his breath. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire I had learned to dread, for it meant the game was afoot. "The shadow of the fourth visitor grows darker, Watson," he said. "And if this glove speaks truly, then we may have found the hand that struck the blow, or the hand of one who knows more than they dare confess." The morning hours in that sombre house passed with a weight that pressed heavily upon all within its walls. Rumour, like a creeping fog, had begun to stir even among the servants, and it was evident that Lady Eleanor's account of the phantom visitor was not universally believed. I overheard whispers in the corridor, suggesting that grief, shock, and an overwrought imagination had combined to conjure a delusion. When Holmes and I rejoined Lady Eleanor in the withdrawing room, I could not but note the strain upon her countenance. She sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes haunted by a fear that would not yield. Yet the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly when two of the household retainers glanced toward her, with a look that mingled pity with doubt. Their silence spoke volumes. Holmes, ever perceptive, did not ignore these murmurs. Instead, he allowed them to flow, as a physician permits a malady to reveal its character. He observed Lady Eleanor with quiet intensity, as though measuring how the venom of suspicion would affect her composure. "It is cruel," she said at last, her voice breaking, "to imply that I, of all people, would invent such horrors. I tell you I saw him. I saw him pass into the study with my own eyes. Are you all blind, or am I alone cursed to behold what others cannot?" Her outburst stirred me profoundly, for I had never doubted her sincerity. Yet I confess that in the recesses of my mind, the question whispered still. Could her terror have magnified some harmless shadow into the shape of a man? The tension between faith and doubt gnawed at me, leaving me restless. Holmes, however, remained inscrutable, and when he finally spoke, it was with the calm gravity of one who has weighed both possibilities. "Lady Eleanor," he said gently, "truth is no respecter of opinion. Whether you stand alone or surrounded by doubters, if what you say is true, it shall prevail." Holmes turned his attention next to the secretary, Mr. Aldous, a nervous young man with a thin frame and restless hands that betrayed his unease. Holmes's questions, though softly spoken, struck like darts, probing with swift precision into the man's account of the previous evening. "You accompanied your master in his business dealings?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir," Aldous stammered. "I assisted in preparing his documents and received instructions for correspondence." "And you remained in the hall when his visitors were announced?" The secretary swallowed visibly. "For some of them, yes. I was present when Mr. Blanchard, the banker, arrived, and again when Mr. Carraway, the cousin, called. I was summoned later to take notes while Mr. Godfrey, the solicitor, was in attendance." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Yet you did not observe a fourth?" "No, sir," the man replied quickly, too quickly. "There were but 3. Of that I am certain." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Certainty is a dangerous luxury, Mr. Aldous. One must distinguish between what one knows and what one assumes. Tell me, what occupied you when you were not in the hall?" The secretary's lips parted, then closed again. A faint flush crept into his cheeks. Holmes observed him with hawk-like stillness, and I thought I saw the man tremble under that gaze. "You had access to your master's papers, did you not?" Holmes pressed. "And opportunity, perhaps, to suppress or alter those which did not suit your advantage." The secretary's eyes widened with alarm. "I never, sir! I was faithful to Mr. Faraday. Whatever you suggest, it is false." Holmes said nothing more. He simply inclined his head, and the silence that followed was more terrible than accusation. Aldous shifted uneasily, his hands wringing each other until the knuckles whitened. Lady Eleanor watched with increasing distress, her face pale with the horror of implication. I could not help but admire the subtlety with which Holmes extracted so much from so little. To any other, Aldous' denials would have ended the matter, but to Holmes, the tremor of a hand, the hesitation of a word, spoke more loudly than all protestations. It was in the great dining chamber, where the stormlight filtered weakly through high mullioned windows, that Holmes chose to reconstruct the sequence of visits. He bade the butler, the maid, and Aldous stand before him, while Lady Eleanor and I listened in taut silence. "The banker, Mr. Blanchard," Holmes began, "arrived first. He stayed but a quarter of an hour, speaking of investments that may, I suspect, have soured. The cousin, Mr. Carraway, followed, lingering somewhat longer, perhaps too long, for kinship is seldom without quarrel when inheritance lies at stake. Lastly, the solicitor, Mr. Godfrey, remained in close discussion until near the hour of 9. Each of these gentlemen had motive, and each had the opportunity. Yet we are assured, by all of you, that there was no other." He turned abruptly, his gaze falling upon Lady Eleanor. "Save by you, madam." Her eyes filled with tears, yet her voice was steady. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I alone." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Then here is the riddle, Watson. 3 men, each with reason to gain by Mr. Faraday's death. 3 men, each vouched for by servants whose testimony is curiously unanimous. And yet, a 4th shadow persists in Lady Eleanor's memory, intruding where none else will admit him. Shall we dismiss it as fancy, or consider whether one of the 3 contrived to appear as 2? The words struck the air like the tolling of a great bell. The butler shifted uneasily. Aldous paled. Lady Eleanor pressed her hand to her lips. As for myself, I felt a chill run the length of my spine. For in Holmes's voice there was no idle speculation, but the cadence of a man who glimpsed the outline of truth beneath layers of deceit. The heavy silence that followed Holmes's reconstruction weighed upon every soul in the chamber. Doubt, like a poison, had already been sown, and I could see in the glances exchanged between the servants that Lady Eleanor's word stood precariously against a tide of suspicion. Yet she, though pale and trembling, rose with a dignity that was almost defiant. "You may question me, you may whisper that grief has clouded my mind," she declared, her voice trembling with passion. "But I tell you again, there was a fourth man. I saw him as I see you. I will not be silenced, nor will I recant what I know to be true." Her words, ringing with conviction, sent a strange thrill through me. It was no feeble delusion that spoke, but the desperate insistence of a woman whose mind clung fiercely to its perception. And yet, what if she was wrong? What if this phantom presence existed only in the theatre of her imagination? I confess that for the first time, I wavered between belief and doubt. Holmes regarded her with the most curious expression, half analytic, half sympathetic. "Madam," he said, "truth has a voice of its own, and it often speaks through those who are least heeded. If you are correct, then the riddle deepens. If you are mistaken, then someone profits greatly from your error. Either way, your certainty is of more value than hesitation." Lady Eleanor sank into her chair, spent from the vehemence of her own words, but the fire in her eyes did not falter. She clung to her vision like a drowning soul to driftwood, and I felt in that moment that her testimony could not be dismissed, however strange it seemed. It was later that evening, as the household settled into a fitful hush, that an incident occurred which cast a fresh shadow over the affair. The storm had abated somewhat, though the wind still sighed along the eaves, when a footman entered with a letter that had been thrust beneath the great door. There was no seal, no signature, only a few words scrawled in a hurried hand. Holmes opened it beneath the lamp, and I, leaning over his shoulder, read the chilling line. The fourth visitor was never seen, only believed. Lady Eleanor gave a sharp cry, her hand flying to her lips. The servants crossed themselves. Even I, accustomed to the tricks of Holmes's adversaries, felt an involuntary shudder at the stark cruelty of those words. Holmes, however, betrayed neither surprise nor alarm. He folded the note neatly, slipping it into his pocket. "A mind that seeks to sow confusion," he murmured. "Note the phrasing, Watson. Not that the fourth visitor did not exist, but that he was never seen. A subtle distinction. The writer hints at deception, but whether he seeks to aid us or mislead us remains to be discovered." His calmness steadied me, yet the words of the letter continued to echo in my thoughts with ghostly resonance, as though mocking our every effort to pierce the veil of this mystery. Near to midnight, Holmes suggested that we take a turn about the grounds. "The truth," he remarked, "has a habit of leaving footprints, even in the dark." Wrapped in our coats, we stepped into the chill air, the gravel crunching beneath our boots, the moon half veiled by clouds. Holmes moved with his usual purposeful stride, his lantern beam darting here and there along the damp earth. Suddenly he paused, stooping to examine a patch of soil near the hedge. I leaned closer and discerned a faint impression, half washed by the rain, a boot print, narrow and sharp. Before he could speak further, there came a crack, sudden, sharp, unmistakable. A bullet struck the stone wall behind us with a vicious spark. Lady Eleanor's scream rang faintly from the house as Holmes seized my arm. "Down, Watson!" he hissed, and together we flung ourselves against the shelter of the hedge. Another shot rang out, splintering the branch above my head. My heart pounded, but Holmes remained astonishingly composed. "They mean to frighten us," he whispered, "or to silence us altogether. Either way, we are close to a truth they cannot risk uncovered." He waited until the silence returned, broken only by the moan of the wind. Then, with a swiftness that startled me, he sprang up, scanning the shadows with his lantern. But the night yielded nothing. The assailant had vanished as if swallowed by the mist. We returned to the house, shaken but unharmed. Lady Eleanor met us in the corridor, her face white with terror. Holmes, brushing dust from his sleeve, merely observed, "A desperate adversary reveals himself by his actions, Watson. We now know we pursue one who fears exposure more than he fears blood upon his hands." When at last we re-entered the great hall, the house lay in uneasy silence, servants whispering in corners, and Lady Eleanor wringing her hands in distress. Holmes, however, betrayed no agitation. He removed his coat, placed his lantern upon the table, and turned to me with that strange gleam in his eye that heralded revelation. "My dear Watson," he said, "we have our fourth visitor." The words fell with the weight of a verdict, and I felt my breath catch. "You know who it is?" I exclaimed. Holmes inclined his head. "I do. The pattern, once seen, admits no other interpretation. The glove, the mud, the testimonies too perfectly aligned. Yes, the mask has slipped." Lady Eleanor leaned forward eagerly, her eyes wide with desperation. "Then tell us, Mr. Holmes, who was he?" But Holmes, with a faint, enigmatic smile, shook his head. "Not tonight. The truth, once spoken, cannot be recalled. It must be delivered at the proper hour, in the proper light. Until then, we must wait." His words fell like a sentence of suspense upon us all. I could scarcely contain my curiosity, but I knew better than to press him when he had assumed that implacable air of resolve. Thus we retired, each to a night of restless dreams, haunted by the knowledge that Holmes had solved the riddle, yet withheld its solution. And so the chapter closed, not with clarity, but with the maddening certainty that truth hovered just beyond reach, waiting for dawn to draw aside the veil. The following evening, as the storm abated into a brooding drizzle, Holmes gave orders that all concerned be summoned into the study where Mr. Faraday had met his fate. The lamps were lit, their glow casting long shadows across the oak panels, while the scent of extinguished candles mingled with the damp air that drifted from the rain-swept garden. One by one, they entered, Lady Eleanor, pale as alabaster, but fortified by some inner resolve. Mr. Blanchard, the banker, his lips tight and his manner stiff with indignation. Mr. Carraway, the cousin, whose restless eyes betrayed a nervous agitation. And Mr. Godfrey, the solicitor, calm to the point of coldness, his gaze fixed with unsettling steadiness upon Holmes. I confess I felt a shiver as I watched them take their places, for there was something theatrical in the arrangement. It seemed less a meeting of anxious witnesses than a gathering of actors upon a stage, awaiting the revelation of a play's grim finale. Holmes stood before them, tall and commanding, his lean figure illumined by the lamplight, his hands clasped behind his back. "Gentlemen, and Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that stilled every murmur. "We are assembled here not to speculate, but to conclude. The mystery of the so-called fourth visitor must now be resolved. One of you bears upon his conscience not only the burden of deception, but of murder. Tonight, that mask shall fall." His words struck the room with the weight of judgment. Lady Eleanor gasped. The banker shifted uneasily. The cousin muttered something under his breath, and only the solicitor remained immovable, his face impassive as stone. Holmes allowed the silence to linger a moment longer, then stepped to the centre of the room, his eyes sweeping over the assembled company. "The riddle begins," he said, "with Lady Eleanor's testimony. She swore she saw 4 men, though every servant and each of you confirmed that but 3 had entered. This contradiction has plagued us, but only because we assumed that truth and falsehood must be cleanly divided. What if both were true? What if Lady Eleanor indeed saw 4, and yet there were only 3? There was a murmur of confusion. Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her lips parted in disbelief. Holmes raised a finger. Consider the nature of perception. A dim corridor, shadows upon the walls, a cloak drawn close about the shoulders. What better stage for misdirection? The phantom was no intruder from beyond, no spectral presence, but an artifice. One man appearing as two. Lady Eleanor's senses did not fail her. They were deliberately manipulated. I felt a thrill of awe as his words unfolded the hidden logic of the case. What had seemed a supernatural impossibility was revealed as a calculated deception. The banker frowned deeply. The cousin muttered an oath, and Lady Eleanor clutched the arm of her chair, her eyes wide with astonishment. Holmes's gaze sharpened. The fourth visitor never existed in truth. He was conjured, by disguise, by timing, by the careful play of light and fear. Holmes now turned directly to Mr. Godfrey, the solicitor, who until that moment had preserved a composure that bordered on disdain. "Mr. Godfrey," Holmes said, his voice as cold as steel, "you were both the third and the fourth visitor." The man's eyes flickered, but he remained otherwise motionless. Holmes pressed on with relentless clarity. "You entered once as yourself, conversing with your client over matters of grave importance. But you contrived to depart in haste, only to re-enter, cloaked and concealed, taking advantage of the gloom to fabricate the illusion of an additional guest. You counted upon Lady Eleanor's sharp eye to perceive you, and upon the servant's testimony to deny it. Thus, suspicion would fall upon her sanity, while you remained above reproach." A gasp escaped Lady Eleanor's lips. The banker muttered in astonishment, and the cousin sprang half from his chair in agitation. Holmes strode toward the desk, where the displaced inkstand still bore its black trail. But deception leaves traces. The glove discovered beneath the carpet was yours, torn from your hand in struggle. The mud upon the hearth was brought by your boots, for you approached too near in the heat of your crime. Your account of time and sequence was rehearsed, yet too rehearsed, every word in perfect accord with the servants, as though memorized, not lived. And finally, the forged documents in your possession, documents your victim had uncovered, furnished both motive and necessity. At this, the solicitor's composure faltered. His lips tightened, his colour drained, and though he attempted to speak, no sound emerged. Holmes's voice rang with finality. "You sought to profit by inheritance and to mask your guilt with the shadow of a phantom. But your mask has slipped, sir, and the phantom is no more." Lady Eleanor covered her face, sobbing with a mixture of horror and relief. The banker shook his head in disbelief, while the cousin muttered prayers under his breath. As for Mr. Godfrey, he sank heavily into his chair, his defiance crumbling into silence. For a long moment the solicitor sat in silence, his features rigid as stone, as if denial might yet hold back the inevitable tide. Holmes, however, pressed forward with merciless clarity, his voice low and inexorable. "Your motive was as base as it was desperate, Mr. Godfrey. For months you had concealed your forgeries, falsifying clauses in the inheritance papers so that the Faraday estate might fall conveniently into hands that would reward your treachery. But your master was no fool. He uncovered the deception, and in that instant your fortunes crumbled. Exposure meant disgrace, ruin, perhaps prison. And so you devised a darker expedient." Lady Eleanor uttered a faint cry, covering her mouth with her handkerchief. The banker muttered an oath under his breath, while the cousin's restless eyes darted between Holmes and the accused. "You murdered him," Holmes continued, each word cutting like a blade. "Not in rage, but in calculation. You staged your own double appearance, creating the illusion of a phantom guest, so that suspicion might be diverted, and Lady Eleanor herself branded a victim of delusion. Thus you sought to cloak your crime in shadows, believing that truth, once hidden in the fog of fear, might never again be brought to light." Godfrey stirred at last, his voice hoarse. "You speak as though certainty were yours, but what proof have you of this monstrous charge?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. Proof enough to leave you without refuge. Shall we proceed?" Holmes advanced a step, his tall figure casting a long shadow upon the floor. He drew from his pocket the delicate kid glove, its leather stiffened with blood. "This, sir, was found beneath the carpet, too small for the victim, but fitting your hand precisely. A trifling article, but it betrays you utterly." He laid the glove upon the desk, then indicated the hearth. "And here the mud. It is of the clay that clings to the garden path, a path you traversed when you crept in disguise to re-enter the house. Your boots bore that stain, and though you strove to erase it, the trace remains." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Lastly, your testimony, rehearsed in every particular to accord with the servants. Such precision is unnatural. Truth, as I have said, admits of trifles and contradictions. Only a falsehood must be taught to march in perfect step." Godfrey's composure shattered. His lips trembled, his hands shook, and a ghastly pallor overspread his face. "It is not true," he whispered, but the whisper lacked strength. Holmes's voice rang with cold authority. "Then why, sir, did you fire upon us in the garden last night? Did you imagine the darkness would conceal your guilt? A desperate hand reveals itself most plainly when it seeks to silence inquiry." At this, Godfrey collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A sob tore from him, harsh and broken, and the truth was laid bare in that sound more than in any confession. Lady Eleanor turned away, trembling. The banker shook his head grimly. The cousin muttered a prayer beneath his breath. The net had closed, and the prisoner was caught fast within its mesh. For a moment, the room seemed steeped in relief. The villain was unmasked, the crime laid open to the light. Yet as I turned toward Holmes, expecting some final words of closure, I saw upon his features not triumph, but a strange, unsettled gravity. He regarded the silent chamber, the fallen man, and the pale faces around him, and then he spoke with measured weight. "The murder of Mr. Faraday has indeed been explained. The phantom visitor was no spirit, but a mask worn by this man, contrived for gain and born of fear. Yet," and here his tone deepened, sending a chill through me, "there is more." All eyes fixed upon him. Even Godfrey raised his head, startled. "After the deed was done," Holmes continued, "another entered this study. Not the murderer, for at that moment he had already departed, but a second presence, one who moved with caution, who shifted the inkstand, who left traces not accounted for by our prisoner. This hand did not strike the blow, yet it tampered with the scene, altering what should have remained untouched." A murmur of horror swept the room. Lady Eleanor clasped the arms of her chair until her knuckles whitened. Then there was another," she whispered. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Yes, madam. Someone else walked these floors after your husband's death. Their purpose remains concealed, their identity shrouded. We have unmasked the murderer, but a shadow remains, darker, perhaps, than the crime itself." The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. The company looked upon one another with fear, as though expecting some unseen figure to step forth from the gloom. And I, though hardened by years at Holmes's side, confess that a chill gripped me at the thought that beyond the man revealed, another spectre lingered, silent, watchful, and yet unknown. The night closed upon Faraday Manor with a silence more dreadful than any storm. When at last the constables arrived to secure the prisoner, Mr. Godfrey was led forth in irons, his face ashen, his figure bent as though the weight of guilt had crushed the very frame that bore it. The rattle of chains upon his wrists seemed to echo along the corridor like a death knell, and his muttered words, half denial, half broken prayer, lingered in my ears long after he had vanished into the darkness. Yet, curiously, with his departure, the house did not breathe relief, as one might expect. Instead, a deeper stillness settled upon its halls, a silence heavy with foreboding. It was as though the very walls, robbed of the man who had defiled them with his crime, now brooded over some unspoken terror that remained unexposed. The servants moved with hushed steps, their eyes wide, their mouths tightly shut, as if fearful that speech itself might summon shadows best left undisturbed. Lady Eleanor, pale as ivory, stood upon the landing as the party passed. She neither cried out nor wept, but clutched the balustrade with a trembling hand, her lips parted in silent anguish. When the last sound of the departing constables had faded into the mist beyond the gates, she sank into a chair, and in the hush that followed, I confess, I felt more oppressed than at any moment since our arrival. For though the murderer had been taken, the house was not cleansed of dread. Holmes, his features inscrutable, remained standing at the threshold of the study, his gaze fixed upon the shadows that gathered thickly in its corners. He alone seemed untouched by the weight of the silence, though his eyes, cold and sharp, betrayed that his mind laboured still upon some deeper enigma not yet unveiled. When I turned to Lady Eleanor, I was struck by the strange fire that yet lingered in her eyes. Though exhausted, though crushed by grief, she clung fiercely to one conviction that no reasoning could shake. "You have caught the murderer," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yet I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I was not deceived. There was another. I saw him. Not a shadow, not a fancy of fear, but a man, real and dreadful. He passed me in the corridor, and his presence chilled my very soul. You may prove what you will of disguises and tricks of the light, but you cannot strip me of that vision. He was there." Her words stirred me with a conflict of pity and unease. For though I longed to comfort her, I could not wholly dismiss the force of her conviction. Her every tone rang with sincerity, and I found myself once again wavering between doubt and belief. Holmes listened without interruption, his face unreadable. At last he spoke, his voice grave, yet not unkind. "Madam, memory is a treacherous servant. It records truly what is seen, but it may clothe in false colours that which fear has half created. Yet," and here his eyes gleamed with sudden intensity, "sometimes fear reveals what reason alone might overlook. The shadow you beheld may not have been the shadow you imagined, but that you saw something, that I do not dispute." Lady Eleanor trembled, her lips pressing together as tears welled in her eyes. She lowered her gaze, as though both comforted and unsettled by his words. The silence that followed seemed to deepen the mystery, for though the murderer had been named, some phantom presence still lingered in her mind, and though I scarce dared admit it, in mine as well. Later that evening, as we sat together in the dim light of the library, I sought to unburden my thoughts to Holmes. The fire had burned low, casting strange, flickering shapes upon the walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of extinguished candles. "Holmes," I said, "do you not think Lady Eleanor's conviction more than grief? She believes what she saw. I cannot rid myself of the thought that perhaps she spoke true." He regarded me steadily, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Watson," he replied, "the mind in the grip of fear is both victim and accomplice. What we believe we see in fear often proves more dangerous than fact itself. Fear colours perception, distorts memory, and grants substance to shadows. And yet," he paused, his gaze turning toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the panes. "Fear can also direct us, as the trembling of a compass needle betrays the presence of a hidden force." His words chilled me, for in them I perceived a double edge, a warning that Lady Eleanor's vision might have been but a phantom of terror, and a suggestion that terror itself might have sprung from some cause yet hidden from our view. In that dim hour, I felt keenly the gulf between Holmes's brilliant detachment and my own human frailty. For while he could weigh fear as one weighs evidence, I could not so easily silence the echo of Lady Eleanor's desperate cry. I saw him. Our departure from Faraday Manor was a sombre affair. The house loomed behind us like some brooding sentinel, its windows glimmering faintly in the mist, as though reluctant to release us from its grasp. Lady Eleanor, spent with grief and dread, had withdrawn to her chamber, and we left her with the care of her household. Holmes and I stepped into the waiting cab, and the driver urged his horse along the sodden lane that wound toward London. The night had wrapped itself in a mantle of fog so thick that even the nearest lamps burned like pale moons in a sea of vapour. The wheels splashed upon the wet stones, and the hoofbeats rang with a muffled cadence, half submerged in the spectral hush. I drew my cloak about me, for the air was damp and chilling, and a peculiar unease settled over me, an unease born not of bodily discomfort, but of the memory of Lady Eleanor's unwavering cry. I saw him. Holmes sat beside me, silent as ever, his eyes fixed upon the shifting veil beyond the window. The faint glow of the street lamps revealed little of his expression, but I fancied that his mind still laboured upon some unspoken thought, weighing not the crime that was solved, but the mystery that lingered beyond it. As we passed through the outlying districts and into the heart of London, the fog thickened yet further, curling like smoke through the narrow streets, clinging to doorways and chimneys, swallowing all familiar outlines. To me, the city seemed no longer a place of industry and life, but a phantom metropolis, its spires, bridges, and alleys transformed into the silhouettes of some vast necropolis, peopled only by shadows. In that ghostly atmosphere, every sound, whether the rattle of a chain, the bark of a distant dog, or the creak of our carriage wheels, seemed magnified into an omen. I could not shake the sense that unseen eyes watched us from the swirling vapour, as though London itself conspired to remind us that not all had been unveiled in the Faraday affair. It was as we turned into Baker Street that I perceived it. Through the fog, scarcely more than a blur at first, another carriage moved behind us, silent, steady, keeping to our pace as though drawn by some invisible tether. I leaned forward, straining to discern its outline, but the mist thickened, obscuring all but the vague shape of wheels and the faint silhouette of a driver perched in rigid silence. "Holmes," I murmured, "do you observe that?" "I do," he replied, his tone calm, though I thought I detected in it the faintest edge of interest. "It has followed us from the Strand." The words struck through me like a chill. From the Strand. That long journey through the twisting arteries of London. And all the while this spectral carriage had trailed our own, never overtaking, never falling away. We turned again, and still it followed. No sound of whip, no cry of driver, only the steady, relentless rhythm of wheels upon stone. The fog wrapped it close, veiling its features, so that I could not tell whether it bore a single occupant or none at all. At last, as our cab drew up before the familiar door of 221B, I turned sharply, but the carriage had vanished. Whether it had halted in some unseen alley, or dissolved into the mist, I cannot say. Only the silence remained, and in that silence the echo of Lady Eleanor's desperate words returned to me with dreadful force. Holmes, descending from the cab, glanced once into the swirling fog, and then turned toward the door. "Watson," he said, his voice low but steady, "we solved the crime. Yet whether we laid to rest the phantom of the fourth visitor, that remains another matter." And so it was that the case ended, not with the triumph of certainty, but with a question that lingers with me still. For in the heart of London's fog, I seem to hear the roll of unseen wheels, and to wonder whether some presence, real or imagined, yet followed, silent, watchful, and unaccounted for. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling like ghostly script against the lamplight. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "the most dangerous enemy is not the one who strikes openly, but the one who bends perception itself. A false visitor, born of disguise and fear, is often more effective than a dagger. The mind, once misled, will cling to its phantoms, even when truth stands plain before it." I could not help but shiver, recalling Lady Eleanor's unshaken insistence that she had seen a fourth man. And now, let me put the question to you. What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it the forged papers, the disguise, or the arrogance of believing Holmes could be deceived? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed unraveling this case with us, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and share the story with friends who delight in a puzzle cloaked in fog.